Today, we are diving into a story that's over 4,000 years old, the story of early India. But here's the twist. This isn't just about what happened. It's about how on earth we even know. How do you piece together the history of a civilization when, for the longest time, the world was told it didn't really have one? Well, let's get into it. You see, for centuries, a really powerful Western idea was that ancient India was ahistorical. Basically, colonial-era scholars came looking for history books that looked like the ones they had back home in Europe. And when they didn't find them, they kind of just threw up their hands and said, well, I guess this is the land of myths and religion, not recorded facts. So, if that's your starting point, where do you even begin? I mean, really, how do you reconstruct entire empires and forgotten societies from what looks like just a bunch of scattered fragments? That's the real detective story we're going to unravel today. To answer that big question, we first need to pop open the historian's toolkit. It helps to think of a historian less like a storyteller and more like a detective. They're not just repeating old tales. They're on the ground, assembling clues from all sorts of sources, many of which contradict each other, to build a case for what most likely happened. And believe me, the detective's case files are incredibly varied. First, you've got the hard physical evidence from archaeology. The layout of a lost city, the pottery people ate from, the tools they used. Then you have what you might call the witness statements, the texts. Things like Vedic hymns or epic poems give us a window into what people believed and valued. And finally, you get the hard data, inscriptions on stone and coins. These are often direct messages from rulers, giving us names, dates, and a real peek into the economy. The most important thing to remember, no single one of these sources ever tells the whole story. And every so often in this detective work, you get a breakthrough that just changes everything. For ancient India, that moment was the cracking of the Brahmi script back in the 1830s. It was a total Rosetta Stone moment. All of a sudden, stone pillars that had been silent for thousands of years started to speak, revealing the actual words of the great emperor Ashoka. An entire lost chapter of history just unlocked. But, having the evidence is only half the battle. The really big change has been in how we read that evidence. The old colonial way was to focus on kings and battles, and they tended to see Indian society as this rigid, unchanging thing. But modern historians are asking totally different questions. They want to hear from the merchant, the farmer, the monk, not just the emperor. They see something like caste not as a single system frozen in time, but as a deeply complex and constantly evolving part of society.
Okay, so with this new toolkit and a fresh set of questions, what kind of story actually starts to take shape? Well, it's an absolutely incredible story of transformation, of a society moving from scattered clans all the way to building one of the ancient world's largest and most complex empires.
Just look at this timeline. The arc of change is amazing. We kick things off way back in the 3rd millennium BCE with the incredible and still mysterious urban world of the Indus Valley civilization. After it declines, society kind of reorganizes into pastoral clans. But then, things really start to accelerate. By around 600 BCE, those clans have grown into larger kingdoms and republics, which sets the stage for the final giant leap, the Mauryan Empire, the first state to bring most of the subcontinent under a single rule. Now, if you really want to understand this society, you've got to get the difference between the theory and the reality. The theory, or the blueprint, is called Varna. That's the 4-part ideal you read about in the ancient texts: priests, warriors, merchants, and laborers. But the reality, the way people actually lived their lives, was based on jati. We're talking thousands of distinct local communities defined by who your family was and what you did for a living. And this is so important because it shows us that society wasn't lived in 4 neat boxes. It was a messy, complex, and always evolving web of human relationships. Now, after a huge empire like the Mauryan one declines, you might expect total chaos, right? A dark age, even. But what historians have found is the exact opposite: an era of incredible dynamism, a real crucible of cultures. It turns out the end of that centralized control didn't create a vacuum, it created an opening. It flung the doors wide open for new people, new ideas, and new trade routes to pour in, connecting the subcontinent to the wider world in ways it had never been before. And just like that, the subcontinent becomes a global crossroads. From the northwest, which was always more of a corridor than a barrier, came waves of new people: Indo-Greeks, Scythians, the amazing Kushanas who built their own massive empire. And at the same time, Roman ships were docking in southern ports, desperate for spices. This wasn't just about trading goods, it was an intense, full-contact exchange of art, language, beliefs, and even DNA. So what was powering all this incredible change? Well, it really boils down to two huge forces. First, global trade. India became the absolute indispensable hub linking the overland Silk Road to China with the sea routes to the Roman Empire. And the second force? Religion. This was an age of intense spiritual creativity, where new philosophies and faiths were all competing for the hearts and minds of millions. And you can literally see that spiritual marketplace right here. Buddhism was evolving into new expansive forms. Jainism was spreading out across the subcontinent. And the great traditions that we now call Puranic Hinduism, focused on gods like Vishnu and Shiva, were really taking the shape we recognize today. The key thing here is that these faiths weren't living in bubbles. They were constantly interacting, debating, and influencing one another. All right, the last major shift we need to talk about is this move away from a single, dominant imperial center toward the rise of powerful, unique regional kingdoms, especially in the south. See, for centuries, the political heartland had been the massive northern plain of the Ganges River. But after the Gupta period, that center of gravity really begins to shift. Power becomes way more distributed, and these strong regional kingdoms start to develop their own totally unique political and cultural identities. This created a whole new map of power. While the north was reorganizing, you had these incredibly powerful new dynasties rising in the south, like the Chalukyas, the Pallavas, and eventually the mighty Cholas, who built a massive maritime empire of their own. And these weren't just carbon copies of the old northern empires. They were inventing entirely new ways of ruling, of trading, and of creating art. And in doing so, they were fundamentally reshaping the subcontinent. And honestly, this is where the rich cultural tapestry of modern India was truly woven. These regional courts became incredible hubs of innovation. They sponsored epic literature in local languages like Tamil, right alongside classical Sanskrit. They built temples in these stunning new architectural styles. It was a beautiful fusion of pan-Indian traditions with vibrant local genius. So what's the ultimate takeaway from all of this? I think it's that history isn't some dusty old book you just read. It's a case you build. The evidence, that piece of pottery, that inscription on a rock, that stuff doesn't change. But the questions we ask of it, the stories it can tell us in return, those are constantly evolving. And that leaves us with one final, and I think really important question. As we get new technologies, new ways of seeing the world, what new stories are these ancient sources going to tell us? What parts of the past, which seems silent to us now, are just waiting for the right question to finally be asked? The dialogue continues.